Welcome everyone to Storytime with Rob. I'm so glad you could join me this morning on this beautifully wonderful, exquisite, gorgeous uh, summer morning, and I can smell the crispness in the air, and it reminds me that fall is just around the corner, which is a little bit depressing. Not that I don't love fall, but I want summer to just last a little bit longer. Well, I got a good story for you today. When Keith Hayes and his wife Kathy decided to adopt, they made up their minds that they would rear the adoptive young one precisely as though it were their own natural child. She was only a day-old infant when her new mommy and daddy welcomed her into the Orange Park, Florida home. They named her Vicky. Keith and Kathy loved little Vicky as much as they would have loved their own flesh and blood. They adoringly dressed and fed and burped and cuddled and cared for her according to Dr. Spock, of course. They agonized when she got a cold. They rejoiced over the appearance of her first tooth. They bragged about her first step and toys. Oh my goodness, there were tricycles and dolls and balls and crayons, a mountain of playthings, many of which Vicky was barely old enough to enjoy or appreciate. So it was in this environment of boundless affection that Vicky celebrated her infancy and toddlerhood. It was Kathy, however, who first witnessed the puzzling behavior. It began one unseasonably warm sunny afternoon in January. Little Vicky was playing with a toy only she could see. A toy that wasn't actually there. Old enough to walk, she was marching around the room pulling a make-believe string attached to a make-believe pull toy. Then Kathy smiled and called, "What are you doing, Vicky?" Vicky, who hadn't realized that she'd been watched, now obviously embarrassed, immediately stopped her pretend game. That evening, Kathy related what she had seen to her research psychologist husband. Keith and Vicky apparently reached the pull toy stage, when everything with a string becomes a toy to drag around. It was the imaginary part that Keith found extraordinary. "See if she does it again," he said. Vicky did it again, and again, and again. At first, only when she thought she was unobserved, and eventually all day long, no matter who was watching. After a while, there emerged a new dimension to Vicky's game. She would pretend to fish with the little toy car, would cast it away and retrieve it by pulling hand over hand in the make-believe string. On one occasion, as she was pulling the same invisible car across the floor, the invisible string became tangled in something. Vicky tugged with all her might. She could not free it. "Mama!" she called out loudly. "Mama! Mama!" And Kathy came running to discover the matter. Much to little Vicky's joy, Kathy played along, untangling the non-existent string in an elaborate pantomime. But as Vicky happily raced off with her imaginary toy, Kathy wondered at the significance of this curious fantasy. Predictably, Vicky outgrew it, and one day the little car that wasn't there anymore. The significance of her behavior was this. It was incredible enough that Keith and Kathy had taught Vicky to speak a few words understandably, but never before had Keith Hayes heard of such sophisticated make-believe. For Keith Hayes was a research psychologist at the Yerkes Laboratories of Primate Biology. He knew better than anyone that nothing is more human than creativity or imagination. And Vicky was a chimpanzee. Quite apparently, Vicky was able to conceptualize, but to what extent she could make conceptual distinctions. For the answer, Keith and Kathy devised a series of visual tests. Vicky's people parents would attempt to communicate with her through pictures. First, they would see if she could distinguish between animate and inanimate objects. They showed her dozens of color photographs, some of people and monkeys and dogs and cats and birds and insects, others of chairs and tables and lamps, and even a few tricky objects in the inanimate group, such as clocks and automobiles, which suggested movement. By demonstrating examples of each category to Vicky, she was taught to place the photos of animate objects on one pile and the photos of inanimate objects on another pile. In this test, Vicky scored extremely well, over 85%. Of her 6 errors, 3 were pictures of insects. The next test involved the categories male and female people only. The photographic subjects were all fully clothed, and both sexes were sometimes depicted wearing shorts and slacks. Youngsters and adults were used. Some pictures showed only heads, others merely facial features. On her male-female exam, Vicky scored as well as or better than any human children in identical experiments. The little chimp also excelled in color distinction tests and in correlating shapes and in comparing sizes. She came to so adept at identifying two-dimensional representations that once, upon discovering the photograph of a wristwatch in a magazine, she put her ear to the crystal, obviously expecting the timepiece to tick. I'm going to hesitate here. With the domestication of any animal comes responsibility. Perhaps none of us can appreciate the extent of that responsibility without having the rest of the story. For there was one categorical examination at which Vicky was particularly proficient: the dissociation of photos of people and chimpanzees. With different clothing and different poses and different camera angles, the test was made as difficult for Vicky as possible. Yet no matter how many times Vicky took the humans with humans, chimpanzees with chimpanzees exam, she placed every picture correctly with one exception. Consistently, little Vicky put photographs of herself with those of humans. And now you know the rest of the story. I hope you have a great day, and until tomorrow, be safe.